Welcome to My Morning Cup, a podcast produced by Costa Media Advisors and brought to you by the generous support of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To learn more about TVA's impact on our community, follow TVA on Instagram at TVA and on Twitter X at TVA News. My Morning Cup, where we have interesting conversations with genuine people. I'm Mike Costa, your host. My guest this week is Chris Hopkins. Chris is a principal in Apogee Wealth Partners. Chris is also a California native who chose Chattanooga before it became the trendy California thing to do. Chris, welcome to My Morning Cup. Before I ask you how many books is too many books to have in a home library, let me ask, what's in your morning cup?
Hey, good morning, Mike, and thanks for having me. And by the way, what a great job you do with this. This has been really a service to the community, and I can't applaud you enough. And after today, it's going to take at least 2 or 3 weeks to get the batting average back up to your normal high standard. But thanks for doing this.
I wouldn't self-deprecate that much, Chris. I think we're going to have a great conversation. And thank you for the kind words. I enjoy doing this. It's, someone asked me early on why I was doing this, and I gave them an honest answer, and they looked at me like, I said, ego. And it is. It's a great ego thing to have people you know and respect come in and take an hour of their day, talk to you about their career and their life, and I learn a lot.
Well, I just have to say, I think we need more conversation. And these are great conversations that you have, and we learn a lot of things about people we know that we did not know about them. So, again, congratulations on your success with this. My morning cup is Major Dickinson Pete's Dark Roast.
It's good stuff, isn't it?
It is black and strong.
How many do you do a morning?
Typically 2 in the morning, maybe 1 in the evening. Doesn't keep me awake, so.
Oh, good for you. See, and everyone who's listening to this podcast knows I've gone decaf because caffeine started affecting me. I actually was diagnosed with AFib, so I gave up a lot of caffeine, and I can't taste the difference. And I know that most people probably can. It's just the benefit of getting your engines raring.
Well, I mean, don't give me a blind taste test. I don't know, but
but I agree with you. The pizza's pretty good.
It is.
So, welcome.
Thank you.
Native Californian, and you may be the second most famous resident of Whittier, California.
And maybe somewhat less infamous than the more famous one, Richard Nixon's hometown.
Thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully. I was born in Whittier, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. LA County now has about 9 million people and 90 incorporated cities in Los Angeles County, and they're all contiguous, essentially. So it's just one great big giant.
So Whittier's in Los Angeles County.
It is in LA County. It's in the San Gabriel Valley. It was a great little place to grow up. Whittier was founded in like the 1898, something like that, by Quakers. Mm-hmm. Named the town after John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a prominent Quaker poet, although he never visited the town. But it grew up as essentially like a ranching. There was cattle, there were horses, and there were a lot of citrus groves. That was really what drove the economy in Whittier. And then when the Southern Pacific built a rail spur into town, they became one of the biggest exporters of produce, including citrus and walnuts. They were the largest walnut producer in the United States at one time. So that's no longer true. Now it's a bedroom community, but it was a very interesting place to grow up.
Well, I was going to ask if they still had the agriculture.
Almost all gone now. It's all basically residential. Development has taken over. And, of course, over time, the walnut trees have a limited life, and they die and you move on. But it's essentially fairly quiet little suburban community.
So when you were growing up there, was your family involved with agriculture at that point, or was it just where you happened to live?
Well, that's just where I happened to live, although my mom's parents actually worked in the packing houses once upon a time. They both were refugees from elsewhere. My mom's mother and her people moved from Missouri during the Depression, and my grandfather moved from Arkansas, and they worked in the packing houses, and then they met each other working in a machine shop during the war. My grandmother was a machinist, and he was her foreman.
So when you say they were refugees from somewhere else, Missouri and Arkansas, And the only description I could come up with is very grapes of wrath. The depression's going on.
Precisely. It was tough to make a living. There was California was the land of promise, and there were jobs out there. And then as the war came on, California was a big armament producer, and my grandmother literally was Rosie the Riveter.
Really? Mm-hmm. And she met your grandfather in a factory?
He was her boss. Exactly right. And then they got married, and the roles were reversed.
Yeah, for the rest of his life.
Well, my grandmother was an interesting character, too. She was the first female distributor for Kirby Vacuum Company. And growing up, I like to say sometimes there was a vacuum in my home. I mean, literally, there were vacuum cleaners in my home because my family was in the vacuum business. My father was a partner with her in a Kirby distributing company.
Well, and what I found interesting is the entrepreneurial bug bit you pretty early, and you were a 6-year-old vacuum salesman.
That's exactly right. That was my first job. I think I got paid 25 cents, but my grandmother taught me how to demonstrate a Kirby. So if anybody is familiar, there may be listeners that don't remember them. They were big, heavy aluminum machines that had a lot of attachments, and they were fairly complicated, or at least they appeared to be. So she dressed me up in a suit and taught me how to do the demo while she talked through it, and it was very difficult for the family who was seeing the demonstration to say, "Oh no, I'm sorry, that's way too complicated for me."
So they weren't coming into a shop. You guys were out banging on doors. She was dressing you up, a cute little 6-year-old.
Yep.
And bringing you in saying, "This ain't complicated. My 6-year-old
That's
grandson
exactly
can
right.
do this."
So she was a genius at marketing. She really was.
Yeah.
She went to, she may have been one of the first women to take the Dale Carnegie course after the war. And she was really, really good at sales and marketing. So they had people that worked for them that what they called at the time canvassing. They would knock on doors and they would offer a little gift if you would allow them to schedule a demonstration. And then I would come in with her and I would do the demo. And so from the time I was 6 until I was about 17 or 18, I worked for her during the summers and on Saturdays.
Did they ever teach you to put the foot in the door so the door didn't come?
We never did that, but she had people that did that. There was one guy that worked for her who actually had carried an ashtray with him, and if they didn't let him in, he would dump the ashes on the carpet and say, "Let me come in and clean them up for you." Seriously, there was some hardcore. One of her salesmen actually sold a vacuum cleaner to a family that had a dirt floor and had a rug, an area rug over the floor. And he came in and demonstrated that thing, and he filled up the bag with dirt in 10 seconds. And they thought, this is just a miracle. This is the greatest cleaning machine ever.
Oh, I love that. I got to get a picture of you dressed up and dumping stuff. And see, it's the easiest thing in the world. Wait, what did that teach you at that age?
Well, first thing it teaches you is how to interact with people.
Yeah.
Right. So as a child, it teaches you to interact with other adults. And, you learn the lesson early on that as a young person, as a child, as a teenager, if you respect your elders, they will respect you. So you learn things about how to relate to other people. Of course, you learn some sales skills eventually. You learn problem solving, you learn how to close, you learn all the sort of the sales techniques. But I think more than anything, it's a lesson of just human interaction.
Yeah, and sometimes I think that's something that we're missing with the young kids. We don't let them be around adults enough.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And our kids were raised the same way. They were raised in a community at our church. My wife and I were very involved in the church and the church choir. So we had friends in our congregation who the kids sat with while we were practicing and singing in the choir. And they learned early on to interact with adults too. And I agree completely with you. We probably don't do enough of that.
Yeah. And you just brought up music. Now, you've got a pretty extensive family musical background too. So you had a musical family?
I did have a musical family. My dad is still at 90 years old a great musician.
Oh, wow.
Plays everything as a songwriter. And so as a child, I'd go to bed as he was getting off of his second job, and he would come home and at 2 a.m. sit around and write songs and play the guitar, play the fiddle, and pick around at the banjo. And so I grew up in a family listening to him, and then eventually learned to play from him. And our family had a little band, a combo. My dad and my mom, who sang harmony, and I played the guitar and the banjo and sang, and my brother played the upright bass. We taught him to play the bass when he was about 11 years old. So we had a really enjoyable childhood growing up with lots of music, lots of laughter in our household.
What was the name of the band?
Just the Hopkins family.
The Hopkins family.
And we did a lot of Western music. We did Western swing. We did gospel. We were kind of on the chuck wagon circuit, I guess you could say, in the church potlucks.
Yeah.
We just had a blast growing up.
Who's your favorite musician if you were picking someone from that era to listen to?
Well, my favorite was always Bob Wills.
I knew it was going to be Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys.
You know, as a kid, I had a clock radio, and it had a little earpiece. It was one of the first ones that had the little earpiece that you could plug into it. So it's time for bed, close the door, and then I would plug in my earpiece and listen to the all-night trucker show because they played Bob Wills at least twice an hour.
I got turned on to Bob Wills probably when I was about 14 or 15, and a good friend of my dad's had moved to Memphis from Oklahoma. And this was a Lebanese guy. Not your typical Oklahoman, but he fell in love with Texas swing. Yeah. And Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, man,
well,
hard to beat.
It started out as a dance band, so it had to have a beat. And then Bob Wills was a really creative guy, was a fiddle player, and then he had a kind of a fiddle band, but then he started adding other instruments, and he incorporated some of the black jazz feel to it, and then he started adding additional instruments. He started adding horns and saxophones and other things, and just kind of invented that Western swing feel. And then later on, a group called Asleep at the Wheel kind of assumed the title, and they're still up and running. So that was really my favorite kind of music, and I actually played. My dad and I played with Lou and Lynn Wamp for many years.
Did you?
With our own Western swing band here in Chattanooga.
I forgot about Lou Wamp.
Yep, sure. And he's down in Florida most of the time now, but we had a group called Swing Shift.
Yeah.
We played Riverbend 2 or 3 times and Miller Plaza, and we played around, did a lot of really cool stuff with Lou me on the guitar, my dad doing some of his songs that he wrote, and Lou on the dobro and the fiddle, and Lynn playing the bass. And then we had some guest artists come in. We did a CD in Nashville, and we just had a ball.
See, that's why I like these conversations. I primarily know you as a financial guy, not as a music guy. But
Sure.
But music is much deeper in your history than financial advising.
No, absolutely. I grew up around it and watching my dad play and how creative he was. My dad is one of 5 boys.
Yeah.
They grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania. And he was the only one who didn't have the opportunity to go to college, but had he would have been an engineer. He's very organized and systematic. My mom, on the other hand, was an artist, and she won. We lived in a very disorderly household, and her unfinished projects in every room. But so he adapted to that, and now that she's been gone about 20 years, he's reorganized his life. But he also has this tremendously creative side. He was a poet, and he can spin these tunes like you just can't believe. He's written a couple hundred songs, probably, some of the most beautiful stuff, and he's just got a real talent for that, and still is writing music.
Well, and looking at some of your history, that runs through it, because I know you told me that growing up you wanted to be a baseball player, but you got hurt on the football field, so you focused on the arts.
That's exactly right. I was a B+ student in high school. I was not really motivated academically. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to play baseball from my earliest memory.
What position?
I was a catcher.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
I
a
loved
hard
it.
position.
Yeah, I loved it. And I was, obviously I was nowhere near good enough to ever have played, but you don't know that when you're 12, 14, 15 years old.
And no one can tell you any different.
And no one can tell you any different. I was pretty good defensively, couldn't hit, but I loved the game, and I wanted to play baseball more than anything. I'd go in the backyard and pretend I was Willie Mays and throw the ball in the air and do the diving catch and all that stuff. So my freshman year of high school, the football coach recruited me. My mom said, "This is a big mistake. I don't want you playing football." And Dad said, "Well, let him make his own decision." And the third game, I broke my leg, and it ended my sports career.
Yeah.
Couldn't play baseball, couldn't squat anymore. So that was the end of that. And it was probably for the best. It really redirected my energy into music. I was in the chorus. I was in a select ensemble. And then I got involved in musical theater and drama in high school as well. So my senior year, we produced Fiddler on the Roof. And I was the lead. I was Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof.
Tevye.
That was my whatever crowning achievement in high school. But I also had the opportunity to meet my wife, Lori, who was also in this ensemble. That was a madrigal ensemble, 20 kids, 10 boys and 10 girls. We toured, played probably 40 or 50 shows a year in high school. And we met...
When you say you toured
locally, around, we played other churches
California,
and
other
dinners,
churches,
local. But we took a spring break tour every year, and this particular year we went to Salt Lake City, and that's how we got acquainted. We rode on the bus together, and we got to know each other. And then after I graduated from high school, we started dating. She was a couple of years older than I, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it all stemmed from that transition to being involved in the arts.
How long you been married now?
It'll be 45 years in August.
Congratulations. It's coming up pretty quick.
Thank you. Yes, it is.
You remember the date?
August 11th. Of course I remember this. She had it tattooed inside my wedding ring.
Smart lady.
Yes, she is.
Very smart lady. So you grew up in almost an idyllic West Coast lifestyle, nice small town, music, sports. You graduate from, California high school, and you go to college.
Yep.
Take it from there.
Sure. So I graduated from high school. As I said, not convinced what I wanted to do. I had a talent for math and science, so I entered college, and I went for about a year, and I dropped out because I was working. I was making a few bucks. I was living on my own, so I diverted for a couple of years, but ultimately went back. I studied physics because I thought I wanted to be a scientist. Along the way, I added an economics degree just because it was interesting. I took a couple econ classes just for fun, and it turned out I really was better at that. So I ended up with degrees in physics and economics. But I realized that I didn't think I had the intellectual horsepower to be a scientist, to go on and get a PhD in physics. I just didn't see it happening. In the meantime, I was already working in a manufacturing company, and I had worked my way through college, and by the time I graduated, I was running the plant in California. I was the plant superintendent. We manufactured.
By the time you graduated from college?
Yeah.
So you're like 22?
Yeah, I was probably 24 at the time.
Yeah.
And I was, or 25, I was the plant superintendent.
That's still pretty darn young.
Yeah, we had 120 employees or so, and we were making attachments for industrial tractors, like backhoe buckets and front-end loader buckets. And then at some point in time around the mid-'80s, I got transferred down to Texas to run a satellite plant. And that plant manufactured for OEMs. We made buckets for John Deere and Case and Ford and shipped them right to their distribution points. So that's how we began our migration east. We lived in San Marcos, Texas for about 2 years in the mid-'80s.
That's just near Austin, right?
It is, between Austin and San Antonio.
My daughter actually got married in San Marcos at a little wedding venue not too long ago.
Well, there weren't very many wedding venues when we lived there in 1986, but that area has just exploded, and Texas State University now has almost 40,000 students.
Yeah, it's huge. One other quick note. You said you were manufacturing and selling the attachments. My father actually, his first job out of college was designing attachments for forklifts.
Really?
So carton clamps,
absolutely,
cotton bale clamps, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Rug rollers, whatever they are. And the last thing I want to note on your academic career, you said you were a B+ student, not really into academics. I know you to be a very smart guy. I got to think you probably had to be pretty bored in school.
Well, I'm not proud of this, but I found out as a senior. I actually considered maybe leaving at the end of my junior year. I had enough credits. My parents didn't think I was mature enough, and they were clearly right about that. But I found out you could miss 22 days of school and still graduate. So guess how many days of school I missed as a senior in high school?
I'd say 21 and a half or 22.
And I got my first C in high school that semester in one of the easiest classes, then unfortunately. But yeah, I was a bit bored in high school, and it imparted some pretty bad habits that I had to overcome when I finally got serious about going to college.
Well, you had to you obviously got serious if you got a physics and an economics degree. I mean, that's got to be a pretty big load, huh?
It was a big load. And at the time, we had gotten married in the interim after I dropped out of college. So I was going back about a year in. And by the time I graduated, we had newborn twins.
Oh, wow.
And I was working 2 jobs to support the family and taking 19 units at college. So
you like a challenge, Chris.
I did like a challenge. I didn't think I really needed sleep. And my morning cup was full all the time back then, believe me.
That's the love of caffeine.
Exactly.
Huh? Yeah. So you go to Texas. How long are you there?
We were there about 2 years.
Was Chattanooga after Texas, or how did all that go?
It was after Texas. So I loved manufacturing. I loved making things, taking raw material, bringing it in the back door, and having something complete go out the front door. And I was enamored with the welding sparks and the smoke in the factory from burning the steel plate and all of that. I just loved the whole process and bending metal. And my dad had been in essentially the same business for 20 years, 25 years maybe, and we'd started talking about doing something together. He was ready to leave California. We were kind of ready to move on, and we'd looked around at several places. And back in 1986, 87, Chattanooga was still a pretty industrial town.
Oh, yeah. It was a manufacturing town.
It was. And in fact, I came on a visit to this very building and met with some folks from economic development at the time, which was called Partners for Economic Progress. And we talked about some sites to maybe locate a place. And ultimately,
When you say this building, you're talking about the Business Development Center.
Business Development Center, where we sit right now, right?
Yeah.
Where your office is located.
Yeah.
They had a development center at the time that was sort of similar to what we're doing with the Tennessee Small Business Development now. So we ended up coming here. We rented a space. We were going to actually kind of build a manufacturing operation to get started. We were doing just job shop work for people like DuPont and Komatsu and Century Wrecker or Miller Industries they are now. So we were just doing production work for other companies.
They had things going on. They would come to you and say, we've got this need, manufacture this for us.
That's right, exactly. For example, we got a call from Miller Industries one night. It was my home phone, that they had gotten a big order from Japan for 6 or 7 big truck wreckers, and they just didn't have the capacity. Would we come get some drawings and see how much we could do? So we brought home 3 or 4 boxes full of drawings, and we manufactured a lot of the component parts that went into those wrecker trucks, that kind of thing. So we would take a blueprint, figure out how to make it. And one of the interesting jobs is we built 6 of the units to spray the colors on M&Ms at the factory in Cleveland when they built a new production line. So that was kind of what we did. And we did that until about 1997, 98. And we felt like we really weren't getting anywhere. We had a lot of capital tied up. We were working long hours for wages, essentially.
Yeah.
So we decided it was time to move on. We sold our equipment and closed the operation and went to the next phase of our lives.
Well, let me just go back a second on the decision to come here, because most people you talk to today are really only here in the last 20, 25 years.
Right.
You came at a time when, yes, Chattanooga still was known as an industrial town, but jobs were flowing out of here too.
That's right.
So was the decision to come to Chattanooga based on not the deal, but the need that the Partners in Progress had and convinced you that this was the place to be?
To some degree, yes. To some degree, it was geographical. We were thinking in terms of locating somewhere within, let's say 3 or 4 hours of 50% of the U.S. population. Look at a map. We didn't want to live in Atlanta or Nashville. We were leaving a large urban area. We wanted something in the middle, in between. San Marcos was a little on the small side. L.A. was too big. Chattanooga was just about right. We really had visions of a very industrial future for ourselves, and that kind of fit the vibe in Chattanooga at the time, although it was late in the game, clearly. Yeah. And as that evolved away, we began to see that this is really not going to work out for us either, and reconsidered that and decided, again, as I said, 97, 98 to wrap it up.
In that interim time when you were building the company, you went on and got your MBA from UTC?
That was just a little bit later when I left the manufacturing business and I went to Merrill Lynch as a stockbroker.
Before then?
Yeah.
But before any of that happened, you had a health issue, didn't you?
That again was right as I was leaving. So in '98 we wrapped up our business. I went to work for Merrill. I spent 2 months studying for my securities exam, and I got my broker's license. And I'm ready to embark on at 39 years old, a whole new career. And a month into that, I had a massive heart attack.
Oh,
39
man.
years old.
39.
Yeah, 100% blockage of the main artery. And I was home alone on a Friday night. My family was all out of town, and I'm eternally grateful that it was so acute that I knew immediately what it was. And I went right to the phone, called 911, and I took my keys and walked out the door and locked the door behind me because I was afraid I was going to lose consciousness and they'd have to try to find me somewhere.
So you went outside so you could
Sat on the
pass out
front
outside?
porch. Yep. Sat on the steps after I'd locked the door so they wouldn't have to break down the door to find me. Then off we went to the hospital, and that was the first step in this very long health journey that I've been through.
How did you know right away? And I asked that in that because, and I'm looking from a guy's perspective. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's weird. Yeah. That'll go away.
Well, so I say thankfully, because I didn't have a mild attack. I had a very severe attack. I was on the verge of losing consciousness, sweating profusely, and a tremendous pain in my arm and my chest. And as I was going to the phone, I looked down, I noticed I had my fist over my chest, and I remembered reading that was a classic sign of heart attack. It's just some kind of reflex. It's called the Levine sign. You make a fist and you put it over your chest, and I thought, my gosh, I'm having a heart attack. So I called 911, and they got me into the cath lab, got me opened up. Eventually it did. Unfortunately, it was 11 o'clock on a Friday night, so it took a couple hours to get the blockage open, and unfortunately I had a lot of muscle damage, a lot of damage to the heart muscle, but I survived it.
Yeah. And what I'm finding interesting is not just the health issue, but you had gone to college and gotten your physics and economics degree. You'd gotten into manufacturing, which to a great degree fits both of those, but now you're going into a completely different field. Right. You're studying for your, Series 7
That's right.
And you're there, and this comes out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. Exactly.
How do you deal with that?
Well, that's one of the things that our family has always kind of done. My wife is a breast cancer survivor, and I'm a heart disease survivor, and we've had a few other little bumps in the road, as everyone does. And our philosophy has always been to kind of focus on the things that we have some control over. Like, where am I going next? What am I going to do? And one of the things I can control is my attitude. How do I face something? And, you kind of think about, what if somebody else is watching you? Not consciously, but you just ask yourself that question. Yeah. So we've always kind of focused almost inherently on the things we can control, like how do we respond to adversity? And the answer is you just put one foot in front of the other and you just keep moving. And you don't focus too much attention on the things over which you don't have any control. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, I've had some heart disease. I had endemic hypertension. My wife had breast cancer. We didn't have any control over that, but what we could control was how do we respond to it? How do we treat the people that are treating us in the hospital, in the doctor's office, along the way? Those are the things, and how and what attitude do we adopt when we approach these challenges? Those are the things we have always focused on, and I think that's the answer to your question. That's how you deal with it.
Did you learn that growing up from your grandparents and your parents, and your wife have a similar experience growing up?
Absolutely. We're so blessed. We both came from intact families who had their own share of adversity and just dealt with it. I didn't realize until later that my family struggled financially. My dad, as I said, worked 2 jobs, and I even remember a time where he couldn't afford to have a car, so he rode a bicycle to work and home. So, there are some lessons you learn that are imparted to you as a child, and I think that in both of our families clearly passed on to us.
And you learn that through observation.
You do.
It's not like your mom and dad are sitting you down and going, okay, here's what this means. You're just watching what they're doing and how they react to things. Are you familiar with the Daily Stoic?
I am not, no.
So Daily Stoic is a book I picked up a couple years ago. It's also a newsletter now and everything else. But it's very much that same thing of, it's not what happens to you. It's how you react to what happens to you.
And that you have control over. Now, we all have emotions. We make emotional reactions, and our impulse is to say, why me? Or, to blame something or somebody. But if you just kind of live your life with that attitude, you eventually recognize, that's not the right path. This is where I need to go. And we both believe it's just helped us tremendously in dealing with adversity, because we just don't dwell on it. And we don't ask the question, why me? Because there is no answer to that question.
Yeah. And you know what? You probably don't want to hear the answer anyway.
Right.
Well, here's why.
Yeah, here's why. Yeah. Well, in my case, some of it clearly was my own fault. My lifestyle, I was overweight. I had hypertension. I smoked until I actually quit smoking. I threw my pipe in the trash on my way out the door in the middle of my heart attack.
Now, see, everyone thinks a pipe's safe.
No. Because you're in this cloud of smoke all the time, and you can't help but inhale some of that smoke. And I did smoke cigarettes as a teenager, and I adopted the pipe. But, bad habits, they came back and bit me. So I don't ask, why me? Some of the answer is my own fault. And some of the answer is nobody's fault.
Right.
Things happen.
Well, and the other thing that goes on with that, and I do want to get to the rest of your story, but is worry.
Sure.
The thing for me over the last 5 years is learning that worry is counterproductive. You can't control something that hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, and you can't do anything about it until it happens. And you're just wasting your time and energy on worrying about something that you have no control over.
Well, you said it exactly. And you do expend a lot of energy worrying about things. Now, it's easier to say that than to do it.
Oh,
and I completely recognize that. But, if you kind of orient your life in that direction, you just keep coming back to it. So that's the short answer to your question. Yeah. That's how we've dealt with challenges.
And that's why I like the book Daily Stoic. It's just a daily reading that reminds me that you're wasting a lot of time and a lot of effort by worrying, by getting anxious, by overreacting. You control the situation by how you respond to it.
Exactly. And you're going to influence other people too eventually if you adopt that attitude.
So you have this massive heart attack. You're in Chattanooga. You're relatively new. Well, you've been there 10 years now.
Right.
But it's your new home. You got in, obviously, the financial services. Did you go to Merrill Lynch?
I did. I went to Merrill, and I have to say I had some real good things to say about the guy who hired me there, the branch manager at the time. Gave me a chance. And then after my heart attack, he realized I wasn't going to cut it. I just didn't have the energy.
Yeah.
Literally, I would drive to work in the morning and I would nap for 30 minutes in my car before I even walk into the office. And the same thing, I'd go out at lunch and take a nap, and he could tell that I was not going to cut.
And that was because there was so much damage.
Yeah, right. And it took me so long to just physically recover from that. I had, about a third of my heart capacity was gone. At 39. So it was a real struggle. I had some pulmonary issues, a real struggle to get back up on the beam. So he was really good about giving me some runway and helping steer me out of that. But I also realized as I researched this that I loved the financial services business. The economic part of this is really what attracted me, the analysis. But I also learned that there are several different models of distributing financial advice, and that the brokerage side, if you're a registered representative, a Series 7, if you work for a brokerage firm, traditionally they got paid with commissions. Mm-hmm. You get paid for taking some action, or you're compensated for selling a product. Now, that's not universally true anymore, but that's one model, is the brokerage model. The other model is the advisor model, where you don't have custody. You're not selling things. What you're doing is selling your expertise. Mm-hmm. And you use a custodian like Charles Schwab or Fidelity or someone like that, Pershing. And then what you do is you manage the assets on behalf of your clients. And the difference there is that you have a legal obligation to do what's right, what's for that in that client's best interest. Where a broker typically has a slightly lower standard. They have a suitability standard, it's called. But they can still sell you products that generate commissions for them. now. As I said, it's more of a hybrid now. They work in both worlds. They can put on one hat and take it off and put on the other hat. But I was just much more comfortable in the advisory world as a fiduciary advisor. So I left Merrill. I went to work for a small CPA firm that had an advisory operation. And then I went back to school. I got my MBA. And I got the rest of my investment credentials, a CFP, Certified Financial Planner, and my CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst designations.
So you went back to school to get all that. Mm-hmm. You're a lifelong learner.
Absolutely. I like to think so, yes.
And part of that is your love of reading.
Absolutely, yeah. 2
to 3 books a week?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
How's that possible?
I don't always get 3 in, but, well, I make it a priority. I read.
Are you fast? Well, obviously you're fast.
I probably am faster than average.
Yeah.
But I read a lot. I consume a lot of information from my job. Read 3 or 4 or 5 newspapers and periodicals and the normal stuff that you have to read to stay up with your work. But I've also always found that reading widely improves your perspective. And I'm generally not a fiction reader. I'm generally reading history and politics and biographies. And I just feel like that informs your worldview. And it helps make you a better financial advisor. It gives you a broader perspective when you're managing assets on behalf of other people.
Yeah. In the subjects that you like, you brought up history. Do you have a favorite historical figure that you have an overabundance of books about?
Probably Abraham Lincoln is probably everybody's answer to that question. I probably have more Lincoln books than any single individual, and certainly more Civil War history than any other genre.
Well, then you had to like moving here because we have so much history here.
It was great. I love it. Yeah. I loved my exploration of the battlefields. Yeah. In fact, the Sherman Reservation was a half a mile from where our shop was. And nobody even knows where that is, right up on the edge of Missionary Ridge, where Sherman made his camp as they were breaking the siege of Chattanooga in 1863.
Isn't that wild that these things are just right here in our backyard? Yep. And not all of them are well marked.
That's right. Exactly. So I'm a huge lover of history. Probably Civil War, Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II is my favorite, but I'm reading a biography of Emperor Justinian right now from the 6th century, and I try to read pretty widely. I'm a huge fan of politics. I'm distressed by our politics today, but I love politics as a subject. One of the greatest favors my mom did was during the summer, she said, you're not going to sit around here all day in the house because you're not in school. So you're going to read for at least an hour every day after lunch. We'd have lunch, and that's quiet time, and you can read anything you want, but you're going to read for at least an hour. And I stumbled across a copy of Theodore White's book called The Making of the President in 1960. So you probably remember Teddy White. He wrote every 4 years he'd write about the presidential campaign. So I'm like 12, 13 years old. And I was fascinated by the race between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in 1960 and how this guy painted the picture of that campaign. And I was hooked from then on.
Yeah. And back to your point on politics, I think because I'm very interested in politics, but I agree with you that the atmosphere today is really just a turnoff to the point that I tune out because either side, I just can't listen to.
It's difficult, and it's a time in our country's development where we shouldn't be tuning out, and it's hard not to. So, right. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, and I think that, as we said when you made the intro, conversation. Yeah. Sitting down and talking to people across the table. I was pretty good friends with Harry Austin at the newspaper when he was still writing 12 editorials a week. Gosh. And Harry and I were on different ends of the political spectrum. And we made it a point to get together 2 or 3 times a year over a beer after work one day and have the most uplifting and engaging conversations and disagreements. And never once did we leave and not say, I learned something and I changed my mind, or at least I'm going to think about it.
Yeah. And you had
that's what we need.
And you had respect for the other person.
Absolutely.
You know, a great example of that was Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill.
Absolutely.
They busted heads all day. You know, Tip O'Neill would paint Ronald Reagan to be this uncaring, Mr. Potter kind of character.
Yeah, right.
It's a Wonderful Life. And then they would go have a beer and.
Well, you remember Chris Matthews, who used to have a show on MSNBC. He worked for Tip O'Neill.
Yep.
He wrote a great book called Tip and the Gipper. And he talks about that from the inside. It's a great read, and it's exactly what you're talking about. These guys could shake hands, and they could count on each other following through on the deal. And they would go hammer and tong all day, and then after work, maybe have a Irish whiskey and trade some stories. But once they shook on a deal,
there's a deal.
You could count on it.
Yeah. And we missed that today. And I didn't want to divert this to politics because I think we could probably do a separate podcast on that. I want to get back to your career path. So you get into financial services, but you've got a lot of damage to your heart.
Yes.
And that's affecting you too. What's the next step in your health journey?
Well, it was for 20 years, one of the guys at Merrill Lynch when I was there said, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to buy you a membership to the YMCA. So I went, and I couldn't even ride the bike for 5 minutes. It was horrible. But I kept going, and I got to where I was working out for like 30 or 40 minutes a day. So for 20 years, I struggled. I did the best I could, and I worked out routinely 5 days a week. I wouldn't be here talking to you if we hadn't done that. So I limped along with a gradual decline in my general health condition. I had several episodes. I had AFib. I had 3 defibrillators. I had cardioversions. I had stents. Wow. I had pulmonary edema. I had lots of interesting episodes. But in 2018, I contracted an infection in my leg that became septic. In fact, it became gangrenous. And they thought they were going to have to amputate, but they said, well, right now the infection is so bad, we're not even going to worry about that because you're probably not going to make it. And That's a hell of a thing to hear. I'm in Memorial Hospital for, a month.
And you're a relatively young guy.
Yeah, at that time I was 60 years old.
Oh, man.
59 at the time. 60. April, it was December of 2018. So they said, yeah, well, you're on every antibiotic known to man. It's up to you now if you make it or you don't. And I did. But and then they said, well, now we're going to have to amputate your leg. But we found a really good wound specialist who was able to avert that, treated me, still intact. But it destroyed the rest of my heart function. And eventually I got down to about 11 or 12% of pumping capacity. So I was enrolled in the transplant program over at St. Thomas West in Nashville. Mm-hmm. We had gone for some testing 2 or 3 times, and they finally said, yeah, it's acute enough that you're likely a candidate for transplantation. Come back on Monday for a heart cath, and we'll do all the final studies. Well, on the table, they saw my pulmonary pressures were so high that they said, you're not going anywhere. You're staying here. And they kept me. So this was in about February of 2019. Eventually, I ended up on what's called a balloon pump. It's an external pump that they thread into your aorta to kind of help with pumping the circulation, but you're tethered to this computer, this machine. So that was my journey up to that point. And because I had this systemic infection, they were afraid that I couldn't receive the transplant. They don't waste an organ on somebody who's going to throw an infection right away. Yeah. So they actually at first said, you're not going to be a candidate, but I wasn't a candidate for anything else. And then they said, well, we think we've got it. And they scheduled me. We were set to go in for a transplant, and at 5 o'clock they called it off because I spiked an infection. So back to the drawing board. And so for the next 3 weeks, we were on this balloon pump. We did all these other things to try to shed this infection. And finally, they gave us the go-ahead. And once they relisted me, I only waited 6 days before I received a transplant on April 18th of 2019.
You have to have an incredible amount of faith, not just in yourself, but in a higher power.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, we've been believers our entire lives, and we certainly do believe. We have a lot of faith, and we have, as we discussed earlier, we have an optimistic attitude. One of the things we did in the hospital, I did on this balloon pump, I was curious. I'm naturally curious about everything. How does this thing work? And the attending nurse said, I don't really know. She said, I just know how to turn it on. I said, well, can you guys find me an instruction manual? And she went and found one. So I read through this whole thing, and I learned how to program it, and then the pulmonologist would come in And we learned, there are 2 or 3 different ways to track your heartbeat. And if you have AFib, it's really hard because the heartbeat is irregular and the pump would get out of sync. And it's working against you instead of for you. So I spent time, jawing with the pulmonologist and learning how to program the balloon pump and learning everything I could about transplantation. I was reading academic papers on, at this point, assuming it was going to happen, I was reading papers on rehab and recovery and how do you reduce the odds of rejection. So I have 3 or 4 big fat notebooks at home filled with papers on transplantation I was reading in the hospital.
Talk about making the best out of a tough situation. And it diverted your attention. It gave you something positive to do.
Of course.
Something productive to do.
Absolutely.
So you have the transplant, and I know, what was it, last year you were actually able to meet the donor's family?
We were. It's just the most remarkable thing. So first, back to that period of time, all those months in the hospital, that my wife Lori was there every single day until I kicked her out. She didn't want to leave every day, and she needed her rest too. But I couldn't have gotten through it without her and the rest of my fantastic family. So after you have a transplant, there's a mechanism. You can send a letter to the other side, to the recipient, or if you're the donor family, you can send to the recipient. If you're the recipient, you can send up to the donor family. But there are strict rules. It's like wartime correspondence. No last names, no locations, just first name, just general information. And you give that to the hospital. And then they send it through the transplant registry up to wherever the other party is. So we received a letter from this young man's mother. Turns out he was 24 years old when he died. And we knew her first name was Laura and his name was Stephen. And other than that, we didn't know anything about their personal details. And we had sent a letter to them. And then we sent another letter and we didn't hear anything. And we called the hospital and they said, well, we sent them. So we kind of assumed that maybe it was too much for them or maybe something happened during COVID. Who knows? But we never really gave up and we kept looking around. We knew that the heart had been harvested in St. Louis. So we were kind of looking in the St. Louis area, trying to, Google obituaries with the names that we knew. But that was a dry hole. So we kept expanding. And so last November, we're in Chicago visiting my daughter. And we just kept pounding away. And we finally found an obituary for a young man who had died in Little Rock, Arkansas, whose mother lived in Cincinnati. They had different last names because she had remarried. Her name today is Laura Watson. That's the mom. She's married to Mike. And she has a daughter who was Stephen's sister, Rachel, and we reached out, said, is this you? My daughter got on Facebook and looked at, 15 Laura Watsons, and we found one who had posted something that was a clue. And so we reached out very tentatively, not knowing if this was the right thing to do or not. And after the initial shock of being contacted, she said, oh, we would love to meet you. So we did a FaceTime the next day. Then in January, we went to Cincinnati to visit with them, and then they came down here the next month. We spent a weekend with them, and we've gotten to be fast friends. They're wonderful people. Laura is now getting active in promoting organ donation in her community in Cincinnati. We talk to her on the phone, my wife, at least once a week. We correspond. It's just been tremendous. I can't describe to you how great it's been for our family and for her family to have seen this thing come full circle. Yeah. In fact, when we told the hospital at St. Thomas how this had come about, they asked us to come to Nashville and speak to their gala, a fundraising dinner for the new transplant center they're building. So I was able to tell a little bit about my story, and then Laura told about hers, and then we offered a toast to her son, Stephen, as part of the fundraising event. And she got a chance, believe it or not, to meet and talk to the surgeon who removed her son's heart and implanted it in me.
I couldn't imagine.
It was just the most fulfilling and incredible thing. And so, yeah, it's been wonderful.
And I wanted to spend some time talking about that because yes, it defines who you are today. But I think it also leads into what you're doing today with Apogee Wealth Partners and the approach you take to it. The approach of very one-on-one, very, very helping people, because that's your journey.
Well, you're right. It is. And it has only reinforced my conviction that this is the right model for us, to be a fiduciary, to be legally obliged to do what's right. We don't sell products. We don't sell insurance. We don't sell annuities. We manage assets and do financial and estate planning for people based on fees. So everything's very transparent. But behind all of that is helping people, doing the right thing. Yeah, we want to make a living. We'd like to make a lot of money doing this at some point in time. It's not everybody probably that goes out and starts up a new business at 64 years old, but I feel like I got a little more runway now and things are going well. But, my other two partners, George Bryant and Jennifer Hairston, feel exactly the same way. We were colleagues at another firm and we saw things the same way, that it all revolves around the client, taking care of your client, doing the right thing, always doing the right thing for them. If you make a mistake, you admit it, you make it right, but you're always looking out for your client. You're trying to help them. And for that reason, we kind of consciously adopted the policy of not necessarily having even a minimum threshold. We have some clients that, some other advisors might not take on, but who else would? And we think, this is just kind of the right thing to do. This is somebody we can help. They need our help. They need our advice. We'll get paid for our time, but it's just the right thing to do. So I think you're right. It does it folds into how we do our business. My partner, George, grew up in a family that struggled to make a living in Spartanburg, South Carolina, making sandwiches and selling to the factories. And when they passed away, they didn't have much to their name. And George had made it his life mission to see to it that other people don't end up in the same place. And so we have that same attitude, and I think that guides everything we do at Apogee.
It's very defining.
It really is.
And when did you start Apogee?
We started in 2021, and then really we formed the company in 21. It took us a little while to kind of get our sea legs and get up and running. So we like to say we've been at it now for 3 years.
Serving clients for 3 years.
Serving clients for 3 years, right.
Yeah. Now, one of the other things you do, before I get to that, how can someone get in touch with you or George or Jennifer?
Oh, they can the best way is just go to our website, apogeewealthpartners.com. All our contact information is there. That's the best way to reach us. My email is chris@apogeewp.com, and you can follow us on all social media platforms.
apogeewp.com. Now, the fact that you're a Renaissance man, music, books, multiple degrees, and you write a column for the Times Free Press.
Yeah, that's my Sunday recreation.
What's the column about?
Well, it's long story. You remember John Vass at the Chattanooga Times? Johnny was the business editor. He called me one day. They would call once in a while for a comment on a story or a news item. And Johnny called me one day and said, "Hey, how about writing once a month for us? Like we get readers' questions, and you answer a question. How hard can that be? Sure, I'd be glad to. When you want me to start? Well, how about this Wednesday? Okay, fine. What's the question? Well, we don't really get any questions, so you just make one up." And that's how I got started. And then one thing led to another, and the other three guys eventually dropped out, and I was doing it once a week. And then they were not kind enough to move me to the Sunday paper a couple of years ago when they went to the all electronic except for Sunday. So my column expanded, but I pick a business topic that I think is interesting and that maybe is a little confusing to the average reader. I try to take complicated issues and make them simpler, or just information on changes. Like we had substantial changes to IRA accounts and 401ks last year as a result of some new laws. So just try to write sort of general interest. I try to mix it up. I laugh and say I write one column 1 week for the reader, and the next column is for me, for my own amusement.
Well, I still can't get over the fact that you're lying in a hospital room and you look at the balloon thing and say, I wonder how that works.
Well, that's sadly, that's how my brain operates.
Yeah, but you were able to not only figure it out, but explain it to the nurse. Yeah, and I think that translates well, too. I got a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
What would you say to that person who might be listening to this who's got some challenges going on? Because everyone thinks particularly careers are a straight shot or life's a straight shot. But the reality is, man, You turn that corner, you get hit by a 2x4 a couple of times. You got hit by a couple. Talk about perseverance.
You probably haven't talked to anybody in this podcast who hasn't had a detour.
No, everyone does.
That's life.
Yeah.
Right. So, my humble advice is, to first of all realize that nothing is a straight line. Nothing goes straight up. You're going to have detours. If you can, take advantage of those setbacks and detours to learn something. You'd mentioned lifetime learning. I'm fortunate enough to believe that that's what I am. I'd go back to college tomorrow if I could do it. Yeah. But always learn something new. I have a dictionary on a stand in my office, and I turn it to a page and get a random word every day and try to memorize it. I mean, just anything you can do to learn something every single day. We did that at our dinner table. What did you guys learn in school today? Make sure that you learn something, you go to bed knowing something more than you knew when you got up this morning. So take advantage of those opportunities to learn from the setbacks. Was it a mistake you made? Was it just happenstance? But so I think taking advantage of setbacks as opportunities is one thing. We talked earlier about just general attitude, and I know this sounds kind of anodyne, but just if you approach things with a positive attitude, that it can get you through a lot of things, and know that you're going to have setbacks. And when you have them, you just, instead of saying, well, why did this happen, or why me, you say, well, what's next? Where do I go? I was on the balloon pump, didn't know if I was going to get a transplant, but they got me out of bed twice a day to walk the hospital. Yeah. And by the time I had the transplant, we were walking 2 miles a day with an entourage of 4 people pushing my EKG, my IVs, and my balloon pump around the hospital out into the parking lot. My gown was flailing in the back, but trying to make something out of a bad situation. So attitude, just, Mike, it goes so far just to, if you can, to remain positive and focus on the blessings we all have. There's always somebody you can point to who's got it worse than you.
Well, so true.
If we can remember that.
So true. So before I get to the last question, I need to remind our listeners who makes this possible, and that's the Tennessee Valley Authority. I thank them for sponsoring My Morning Cup. Follow TVA on social media to learn more about its multifaceted mission of service, and visit TVA.com/do good here to explore exciting TVA career opportunities. All right, the money question, the last question. What would you tell your 25-year-old self is important for a happy life?
Relationships. I was lucky. I hit life's lottery when I met my future wife in high school. Why, to this day, she said yes, I have no idea. But
did you sit down on the bus next to her? Or did she sit down next to you?
No, I think I pursued her.
Good man.
So I was a young sophomore. She was a big time senior on campus, but we, I got lucky. There's no question about that. But she has been by my side the entire time. The secret to everything is relationships, a good, loving relationship with your spouse, with your significant other, with the rest of your family. And I think that's been the keynote certainly of my life, is relationships with my family and my wife in particular.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've enjoyed building a relationship with you over the last year and a half.
Likewise. Yeah.
And you have a fascinating story, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to tell it.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity, and congratulations on your success with the podcast.
Well, thank you. This was fun. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to My Morning Cup, a podcast by Costa Media Advisors. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. I release a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.